name is Stacie Couvillon. Thanks for coming. My title at INHF is Plan, Giving, and Major Gifts Officer. And I've been with the organization for a little over 3 years. I'm excited to be here and talk about protecting land and how we can do that in different ways. As you probably know, INHF's mission is to protect and restore Iowa's land, water, and wildlife. And we've been doing that for 46 years and looking forward to many more years of doing that. We were started in 1979, or founded. Then Governor Robert Ray gathered business and community leaders to form a founding board of directors for INHF. And the vision that Governor Ray had and the board members was to create a nonpartisan means of uniting government, business, and private citizens for the sole purpose of protecting Iowa's valuable natural resources. Since our founding and continuing today, INHF has served and is serving as an intermediary, acquiring land from willing landowners on the behalf of a public agency. We hold that land until the public agency has the funding to take that from us. And together we create more parks, trails, and wildlife areas when we work in partnership with those agencies. Across the state, INHF has protected over 200,000 acres. We're pretty proud of that number. That's significant. We have projects in all 97 counties. We hold 243 privately protected conservation easements, and INHF itself owns and stewards 10,000 acres. So that's a lot of work that we're doing day in, day out, and we all love it, and we know you do too. This is just a map showing the projects that INHF has worked on. So the dots in green are INHF properties that we're taking care of and stewarding. The yellow dots are the INHF held easements, so we're all over the state. And then the lines are the trail projects that INHF has been a part of. So we're just about in every part of the state. Today we're kind of coming to you to talk as landowners with INHF and about creating conservation legacy with your land. People come to INHF wanting to create this legacy with all sorts of goals in mind. Some of them may be simply having a peace of mind of knowing their land is protected. Some people come wanting to protect their land for future generations of their family or just future generations of Iowans. They protect wildlife and give future generations of all Iowans a greater quality of life. Some things to consider as you're considering protecting your land are things like, do you want to continue to own the land yourself? How do you want the land to be used during your lifetime and beyond? Do I need financial compensation for the land? And are tax savings important to me when I'm thinking about protecting land? Another thing to consider is, do you want your land to be accessed by the public for any number of purposes, but just is that something that's important to you? And then, of course, who might oversee the taking care of the stewardship of your land in the future? Like, who might be the next owner or caretaker of the land? Erin and I are going to be working through this chart and talking about different types of landowner options for protecting land. And the first option here is a conservation easement.
Good afternoon, I am Erin Van Waus. I'm the Conservation Easement Director at INHF. I've been on staff for 15 years, spent most of my time in conservation easements, but dabbled some in our land stewardship program and land management, as well as farm management. An easement is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a conservation organization that permanently protects your land forever, so that no matter who owns the land in the future, that easement will remain in place and you'll have that peace of mind that it is protected forever. This is one of our most popular private land protection tools because it allows you to protect the land but also continue to own and manage the land. As Stacie mentioned, we have 243 easements across the state that have protected over 28,000 acres. And so I think it's a really amazing program when you partner it with, or even you pair it with our public land acquisition, and then you have this private land protection. From a water quality standpoint, wildlife habitat, they don't care who owns the land, but they care that it's protected and those corridors are preserved. And so this is why it's one of the more popular protection options. Many landowners come to me and say, well, my property is an all woodland, or it isn't all 100% habitat. I guess I don't qualify for the program. And that's just not true. Many of the properties that we protect are mixed-use farms. There may be habitat areas of the farm you want to protect. There may be row crop areas that you want to protect just for that purpose as open space, protecting some of that scenic beauty that your property offers from the roadside. And so Iowa Code 457A and the IRS Code has outlined these purposes that we can grant conservation easements for. Some commonly permitted and prohibited uses in our conservation easement documents. The permitted include like all your recreational activities, hunting, fishing, trapping, the restoration and management on the farm, burning your prairies, managing your woodlands. Those are all decisions you as a landowner get to make. Easements are consistent with forestry practices and oftentimes consistent with many USDA programs. We do have to pay special attention when we're working with CRP and conservation easements, but we work through that with each landowner to figure out what their goals and their desires are. Also permitted agriculture within designated areas, walking paths, access lanes, docks on your pond, things like that. Then on the right, you see the commonly prohibited uses. Destruction of the natural areas that we're wanting to protect with the conservation easement. Buildings outside of the building envelope would be prohibited. Dumping, billboards, mineral extraction, large animal confinement operations, and also splitting of the farm into separate ownerships. And so really thinking about that contiguous habitat that we can protect with each conservation easement. Another common question is about access. And so really want to make clear that the conservation easement does not grant any public access to your farm. You as the landowner get to determine who you allow or don't allow on your property, just like you do today. And so that gives people a lot of comfort, one of their first questions. With the conservation easement on your farm, you still retain that private ownership. Those land decisions and management responsibilities are still with you, but it's subject to the terms of the conservation easement. You're able to retain that income from the farm and work with those USDA programs. When someone places a conservation easement on their farm, it oftentimes does reduce the value of their property because you're restricting some of those uses. And there are tax benefits that are associated with that reduction of land value also. So when somebody calls us up and they want to do a conservation easement, we have a form that we work through. The different colors show what I'm responsible for, what the landowner is responsible for. It is a very collaborative process. We start with a conservation easement template, but we work together to make sure that your vision is captured in the conservation easement and we're adequately protecting the conservation values on that property. We'll put together a series of maps and photos, and I'll share an example of that later in this presentation. We go through legal review and our board approval, and then we're ready to sign the conservation easement. Everybody asks how long it takes to do a conservation easement, and it really just depends. Just for the reason, because as you draft it, there may be questions that you think of or that come up that you did never think of before. And so we want to just allow that space for you to be comfortable and happy with the terms of your easement and not feel rushed through the process. But typically, I would say like 3 to 6 months. Sometimes people take years, sometimes decades to make the decision. Because it is a permanent decision, it's not to be made lightly. And so in the end, we just want a document that you as your family is happy with and the organization is happy with as well. So there are different types of conservation easements. What we do most at the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is what I call a donated conservation easement, where you approach us, you know that the value of your land is likely going to reduce with a conservation easement, and you can receive those tax benefits. but there's no cash that's exchanged at the time of the easement. And so we call that a donated easement. Another partnership program, the next to the agricultural land easement and the wetland reserve easement program, those are in partnership with NRCS. And so both of those programs have federal dollars available, and there's a ranking criteria that you go through to see if you receive funding for protection of your property. So the agricultural land easement program, as you can guess, really looks at protecting agricultural land for agricultural purposes. But there's also those staff benefits within there. You're protecting water quality, you're protecting your pasture, and your back woodland for habitat purposes. And so INHF takes a lead role in doing those agricultural land easements, but NRCS is a partner. They bring the cash to the table. And so with that land easement program, there is a 50% payment of cash for the easement value. And so that's what's unique about that program. The wetland reserve easement, you might have heard that if you have hydric soils or wetlands on a farm, or maybe some wetlands have been drained over the years that you want to see restored on that property, there's a wetland reserve program that is ran largely by NRCS. And so they'd be your great contact there if you're interested in one of those easement programs. The agricultural land easement is an easement that we hold and we monitor in perpetuity. And so we do have a much more involved role if you choose that agricultural land easement path. The NRCS is still involved on the backside if we were to ever neglect monitoring responsibilities or enforcement. They can come in since there are government dollars in that conservation easement. But the wetland reserve easement is monitored and enforced by NRCS. And so we don't have as much of a role in monitoring that easement, but oftentimes some landowners choose to enroll in the wetland reserve easement program and then say, gosh, I'd really love for this to be open to the public. And we can work with that landowner to buy the residual value of that property and then make that available for public use. And so you'll see throughout this process, you can pair different combinations of protection options to get to that end goal. All right, now these are some of the examples. So this is a landowner that I worked on their conservation easement. We drafted the easement, and then we needed to designate different areas for different types of uses. And so that map on the left, the blue area outlines the row crop areas. And so that can be cropped according to a soil conservation plan. And then on the right, the red outlines the pasture area. And so they glean the stalks in the fall and the winter, but then graze in the upper end of that ravine, but then while also protecting the oak hickory woodland that's further down the northeast corner of that property. And so you can see how we can designate different uses, and this is a really great example of a mixed-use property. Same farm, another example, they had a calving shed on the southern boundary. We identified that area as a building envelope, and then that calving shed or any outdoor structures could be built or rebuilt in that area. The map on the right shows there's existing utility corridors that go through the farm. Those were there before the conservation easement, and those utility companies have the right to repair, replace, maintain those utility lines. And if there's ever new utilities that are requested on the farm, there would be an approval process that would be in line with the conservation easement. So with each of the 243 conservation easements we hold, we get out once per year and monitor the conservation easement. We call up the landowner and says, what's a great time to meet on the land? We don't want to interfere with some of your enjoyment of the property, or maybe if you're out of the state for a portion of the year, we just really like to get out on the land together, hike the property, and ensure there's no violations with the terms of the easement. And so we have 10 staff that help assist with that monitoring each year.
As Erin alluded to, sometimes landowners are interested in protecting their land, but not real sure what the best fit for them is. And sometimes donating land is an option for individuals. And thinking through some of the criteria that you would think about as you're thinking about protecting your land, this chart shows, the flexibility, the timing, who's making decisions for the property, do you need tax benefits, and are you gaining income from your property? So when we're talking about donating land, oftentimes This is a very more straightforward way to protect land because you are making the gift of land during your lifetime. You're able to visualize, to see your goals and visions for the land come to fruition. We do enjoy, well, we have to know who you are, I guess. We enjoy meeting with you so that we as INHF, if you're donating to INHF, we'd like to draft and write what we call an intention letter so that we can document your reasons, your intentions for making this largely significant and often very emotional gift. We like to know what you'd like to see happen on the land, who you'd like to see be the long-term owner of the land, what type of use you'd like to see happen with the land, if you'd like the public to be able to enjoy it. So these are all things that we would have a conversation about so that we could keep those in the record, in our record keeping. Other types of land protections may be a bequest. A lot of times donors like to know, like that peace of mind of knowing that when they can no longer steward their land may be taken care of by INHF or another conservation organization. This gives the landowner flexibility to maybe change their mind. Maybe a family member they didn't know at the time was interested in the land, but then later decides they would like to protect their land or they would like to own that land from their family member, and that your will or your estate plan can be changed. So there's a lot of flexibility in that. This is another one of those protection options where INHF would love to get to know you as the landowner and know that you have decided to bequeath your land, your farm, your property to INHF. We would like to create that intention letter when you're around to tell us the story of your land, so we can keep that as a permanent record with the property. We'd like to know your visions for how it might be stewarded or how it might be used into the future. But this bequest option allows you to use and take care of the land during your lifetime so that you're realizing all of the pleasure and potentially income from your land. And then another type of protection option is a reserved life estate, donation with reserved life estate. And this is a very interesting, I think, gift or protection option because it is often a middle ground between donating the property today and bequeathing it into the future. With a donation of reserved life estate, you're making the donation, you're agreeing to donate the property to an organization, but you're continuing to have life use of that property, which means that you are still recreating on the land, you're living on the land, you're realizing any income from the land, but you have that peace of mind of knowing that either when you're gone or that the property will be taken care of by INHF or another organization, or perhaps a few years down the line, you realize you would really rather live in California than Iowa, and so you can relinquish your life use of the land and just say, INHF, I'm going to move to California, please, now you're fully vested with my property, please take care of it. And that has happened with INHF. We have properties like that. The beauty of the reserved life estate option is that, again, during your lifetime or for a period of time, it feels as if you are the landowner, nothing has changed. You are still making all of the decisions for the land. Again, you're realizing any income, you're taking care of the taxes associated with that land. But again, you know that you have already looked out for the future of the land by making that donation.
How does INHF look at either outright gift or a bequest or a gift with retained life estate if there's a mortgage on the property?
Yeah, so when you're doing a conservation easement, the bank needs to get involved. And I believe that would be the same, well, definitely if it's a donation, the bank wants their money first. But a reserved life estate and with a conservation easement, the bank would have to be subordinate to whatever protection strategy you're using. And so there's conversations with the bank. I imagine with the reserve life estate, they may want to be made whole, or they may want other assets, like use a different asset as collateral to shift that around. But that's a really important thing to know early in the process, so we can work through it with either your attorney or financial planner.
So when you're thinking about protecting your land, again, having conversations with INHF is a great place to start. We have this landowner option booklet, which I have on the back. Many of you have probably had it at various times. This booklet outlines a lot of the same things that Erin and I are talking about today, but using that as a starting point to maybe begin to think through the questions that you may have or that we would be asking you about what your goals are for protecting the land and how then INHF can be involved. But INHF views land protection as a very collaborative process. We want to we're walking this path with you. So we are working together with the landowner to make these protection decisions to ensure that you have the peace of mind and the security of knowing that your land will be taken care of into the future. The process of gifting land is very special, and INHF wants to make sure that we are doing all the right things for you and your land.
So at the beginning of the presentation, you saw this map when Stacie was talking about some of the public land protection that we've done. That's a lot of the green dots there on the state, and the red are the trails. And so just really working with our public partners, thinking about ways that maybe different public use or access or educational purposes that they may be interested in a property. And so we've had landowners approach us, say, I want to make sure that my land is protected for conservation purposes and for recreational uses. Is this something that either the Black Hawk County Conservation Board or the DNR is interested in? And so we can be that middle ground between you as the landowner and that public partner to start having some of those conversations. And when that happens, there's two different options that we can use. We actually can use all of those previous options we talked about today, but sometimes a donation may not be feasible, but a bargain sale might. And so that may be the perfect fit for a family if they really want to protect their family legacy on the property, but they want to see it go to public ownership. And so with a bargain sale, so you're receiving cash, but you're receiving less than the fair market value for the property. And oftentimes that does increase the likelihood of public acquisition. There are tax benefits associated with bargain sales. And then the other option is that fair market value sale. Maybe you own the land with siblings and you guys can't agree, and that's the option that you can get everybody to agree on. There would not be any tax benefits with that, but you know that selling to a public entity or working with INHF to get that land to a public entity would ensure that those conservation values would be protected in perpetuity. One example of that, I'm bringing you up to Chickasaw County. This is along the Waus River. It's a 205-acre property, that long yellow piece there. This is a Keensville property, and this is one where they layered different protection options. And so you see the name, it says Keensville WRE property. So that means they first did a wetland reserve easement with the NRCS to restore those wetlands on the property. And so there's a federal easement that protects the wetlands there. And then they said, this property means so much to us, we want to make sure that it's protected and we remember it. And so they did a bargain sale on this property so that it could become part of the greenbelt and part of the public area that is offered here. And so that was really important when we went to write grant applications, that there was that bargain sale that helped get this project across the finish line for Chickasaw County Conservation Board. I just want to show one example. This is up on the Upper Iowa River. And so we have Kendallville in the upper left corner, and then Bluffton, that next yellow star down there. And so this photo here is of the Chimney Rocks. That's in one of the loops of the river. Really popular area for paddling and canoeing, fishing, and hunting. And so what we have up here are the areas that are protected as public land. And many of these properties INHF has helped acquire over the years. So we have public land in green. Then we add some of those federal easements. Those agricultural land easements, those wetland reserve easements are those pink colored polygons up there. Then we add in the INHF owned or INHF held conservation easement. And you can really see how it's like a big puzzle piece of all these different protection options that can help protect the watershed you love or the neighborhood that you enjoy recreating in. And so this is just a visual to show how over time this can all come together. And so really using that combination of strategies to reach your conservation goals. These protection options can be really important for using estate planning, but ultimately it gives you, your family, that peace of mind that all that hard work, all that sweat equity that you put into the tree planting, the prairie planting will not be undone in the future.
So I'm Paul Morf. I am an estate planning attorney. And what I do every day is I help families decide what to do with their farms and businesses and property when they die. Tax planning, family dynamics, business succession planning. But because my kind of hobby is nature, and all my boards that I've chosen to serve on, like INHF, I'm on the INHF board, are things related to nature. One of the favorite things I get to do is I get to work on projects for clients who want to do conservation things. So I have gotten to work on a lot of really neat things around Iowa over the years, and that's really fun for me. So my law firm is Simmons Brine. And so when I talk to people, and I assume all of you here may have a special place or you wouldn't have chosen to come to this, a lot of times the questions I'm talking to families about are, when I die, will my kids sell the farm or the woods, whatever it is? Will my kids disagree with each other about whether to sell the farm? What if my kids don't want the farm? What if nobody wants to live there? What if they all live on the coasts, right? Will whoever comes after me see the conservation value of the land or only its economic value? And I think a lot of people who have a special place, and I do, and I'll tell you about it, it's almost like another child for them. It's not just an asset, it's a legacy that they care about. And Erin and Stacie talked well about these different options. You can donate it to a conservation-minded nonprofit organization. You can donate a remainder interest. You can do a bargain sale if you can't afford to give it away, and if the charity in question has the funds to buy it. Or you can leave it to your children subject to a conservation easement that is held by a private land trust or county conservation board, or possibly like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A land trust is just a private nonprofit. It's not the government. So I know there are a lot of people right now talking about the government and too much public land. And INHF does help governments acquire land by being a bridge, but they also hold these conservation easements. And when you ask them to, they will hold land. And they're not the government. So I like using a private land trust because I don't worry about mission drift. I don't think if the political winds change, somebody's going to decide to sell this property off, or open it up for mining or whatever it is. So I always try to find a private land trust as a partner when I'm working on a conservation project. Their charter, like the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation or the Nature Conservancy or the Borough Land Trust, is to protect those conservation values. And they don't have any other mission, right? So there's not going to be mission driven. There are 17,000 land trusts protecting 40 million acres. In Iowa, Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is by far the most relevant. It does the most work. I also am on the Iowa Board for the Nature Conservancy. I like it because it ties into regional things and it kind of connects me to the global effort to preserve nature. And they are very active in certain places like along the lower Cedar River and up in the Little Sioux Valley. But in most parts of Iowa, if it's not one of their kind of focus areas, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is the entity that's most involved in these things. If you have a very small property, like 5 or 10 acres, often the County Conservation Board is the best partner because they're used to dealing with smaller projects. In Johnson County, the Borough Land Trust is a really neat little land trust that has a lot of prairie remnants and things like that. And then I've worked with White Rock Conservancy and its founders, the Garst family, for a long time. It's a really neat kind of private land trust that was set up by one family to continue their legacy in Coon Rapids, Iowa. So there are a lot of these. There are some others. There's one up in the Driftless area. But Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation it does 90% of the work in Iowa. So because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to talk about the tax benefits. People who are doing these things are not doing it for the tax benefits. They're doing it because they care about property. But if you are going to protect the conservation values of your land, there are some tax benefits. And so the definitions are in Chapter 170, Section 170, subsection H of the Internal Revenue Code. So to get these tax benefits, you have to be giving a qualified conservation contribution. And there are 3 requirements. You have to have a qualified real property interest, which is permanent conservation easement, remainder interest in a ranch or farm, or land for the most part. It has to go to a qualified organization. Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation qualifies, so would your county conservation board. And it has to be given exclusively for conservation purposes. So conservation easement does have to be perpetual. There's been some discussion at the federal level that they should put a time limit on conservation easements because we're taking land out of production, and it should have to expire after 100 years. That is currently in complete opposition to the requirements of a conservation easement, which it has to exist forever, theoretically. The conservation purposes that it has to advance, there are a number of them. One is just to preserve land area for outdoor recreation or education of the general public. So if you give it to the DNR and make it a park, that works. If you have a conservation easement where you do not invite the public in, you're going to have to go to one of these other ones. Second, the protection of a relatively natural habitat of fish, wildlife, or plants, or similar ecosystem. So one of the things that Erin and her team do when you're creating an easement is they go out and they do a baseline report, and they document all of the kinds of species they find there to show that there is a relatively natural habitat and an ecosystem that they're trying to protect. Third, you can do a conservation easement just to protect open space where such preservation is either for the scenic enjoyment of the general public or pursuant to a clearly delineated federal, state, or local governmental conservation policy and will yield a significant public benefit. So the easements often also talk about, this is in the, Little Sioux watershed, and there's a state interest in increasing the water quality of that water, also it's been designated as a critical bird area by Audubon Society, so they go back and try to tie it to these governmental purposes. But as long as you have a hook, you can have crops that you put a conservation easement on, and it stays in crops, and all you're giving up is the right to really subdivide that and put houses on it. But as long as it can continue to be in agriculture, because that is open space, it is scenic enjoyment, and it's in an area where we're trying to do some preservation. I don't really get involved in these historical structures, but if you had a very important building that was on the National Historic Register or something, you could do something with the conservation easement there as well. So you get both a federal and a state tax benefit if you do one of these gifts: easement, outright gift, remainder interest. You get to deduct the gift for federal purposes. So a deduction is not a credit, right? It's not like I give you a dollar. It's you don't have to report income on your tax return up to the amount of your gift. It's a deduction. And so it is worth more to you if you're in a higher tax bracket. If you're in a 37% federal tax bracket, you get 37% of your gift back, essentially. If you're only in a 15% federal tax bracket, you get 15% of your gift back. Okay? So for higher income taxpayers, it's more valuable. And all charitable gifts are limited to a percent of your adjusted gross income, which is very close to your taxable income. It's after we've taken a few deductions. But you can only take half of that every year in conservation easement donations. However, if you're a qualified farmer or rancher and you meet certain requirements, which among other things is that it's stay in agriculture, you can deduct up to 100% of your adjusted gross income. Now these are higher limits than for other kinds of gifts of land. If you were giving land just to Mercy Hospital for them to sell and use for their mission, you'd be limited to 30% of your adjusted gross income. So this is a federal policy to try to encourage this. Now, what if you don't have enough income to absorb your entire gift? You have a carry forward, and that's also longer. Usually the carry forward is 5 years for charitable gifts. For these kinds of gifts, it's 15 years for federal purposes. So as long as you have enough income to absorb that gift with 50% of your AGI, over the next 16 years, you will eventually be able to deduct it all. There has been a really strong federal policy encouraging this, and by the way, it was bipartisan. I have a slide later. Senator Grassley was one of the people who really pushed to make this permanent, and he talked a lot at the time about how great this was. There has been some abuse of especially conservation easements, especially out west. And what's happened, for example, is some investor will come in, find a bunch of people who need tax deductions, and they will get a piece of land, maybe out in Montana, and put it in an LLC or an S corporation, get all these people to invest, and then they take a very aggressive position that the land is highly developable and is worth $100,000 an acre, but after you give up the development rights, it's worth $1,000 an acre or something like that. And all of these investors that really have any connection to the land were taking these huge tax write-offs, and it was abusive. And the INHF was part of trying to get this curtailed. Well, there's new legislation that has put limits on the ability to do conservation easements through pass-through entities, primarily partnerships, LLCs, and subchapter S corporations. It could be certain irrevocable trusts that are not grantor trusts could also fall into this. And so there are some exceptions. It only really comes into play if your deduction, the value of your gift, is more than 250% of your basis. So if you bought something for $1,000 an acre and you're saying now it's worth $2,000, and with the easement on it's only worth $500, your gift would be $1,500. It would only be 150% of your basis. You would not have a problem. But if you get more aggressive than that and you say now it's worth $5,000 an acre, my basis is only $1,000. My gift is $4,000 an acre. Now you're above the threshold where you're going to get some scrutiny if the donor is an LLC, partnership, S corp. There are still some other exceptions. If almost everybody who owns this business is related, they're all, it's dad and 3 sons. And you have to be very careful because the way this is written is confusing. But if it's one family that owns everything, you might have an exception. And if it's an old LLC that's owned this for more than 3 years and no interest in the LLC have changed hands for more than 3 years, you may also be okay. But I guess my takeaway from this is very complicated. But if you have land in one of these things, do not consummate a conservation easement, including or any conservation gift, without significant prior input from specialized legal and tax counsel. And I think INHF is really worried about these rules because it's a little bit cloudy. We don't have good regulations, so people are going to be careful. We're all learning about it together. So what about Iowa? That's the federal. So Iowa also really has a public policy interest in trying to incentivize people to make these kinds of gifts. And in 2008, there has been a credit, and it still exists. I don't know that it's under attack, but for 50% of the gift, you get a credit back. And a credit is different. So if you give land worth $100,000, and that's your gift, you gave it away, it's $100,000, your credit is 50, it's 50%. And that 50,000 credit, that's dollar for dollar. It doesn't matter what tax rate bracket you're in, you get the same value. Now, that distinction doesn't mean as much in Iowa anymore because we have a flat tax, which is 3.8%. And so the trouble is, even though this is a very generous credit, a lot of people don't have much state income tax anymore, right? Because if you have 300,000 of adjusted gross income for state purposes, 3.8% of that is only like $12,000. So if you had a $100,000 gift, it'd take you 9 or 10 years to absorb that because you're not paying much state income tax. It is a 20-year carry forward here, so you can absorb it over 21 years. Right now, the law in Iowa makes it very hard for me to do a conservation easement gift and get this credit because my law firm is paying something called the pass-through entity tax to avoid the cap on the deduction of state and local income tax at the federal level. So I'm not paying state income tax. My law firm is paying it essentially on my behalf. And so the credit, I can't, I've looked at it, I can't actually take the credit and also do the salt. So there are some people who will not get that credit. You would then just get a deduction. But for somebody who qualifies and who has enough state income that they can absorb it over 21 years, it's pretty powerful. A pass-through entity can take this. There's no attack on this at the state level. So if you have an LLC or an S corp, the entity is capped at the $100,000 limit rather than each owner. And at least several times in my career, we've had husband and wives each give a 50% interest in a farm and each take this credit. And I assume you guys are still seeing people do that. So a married couple can probably get it twice. So here's just an example to put some numbers to it. Joe Donor lives in Blackhawk County, and he gets a qualified appraisal showing that Black Acre, his farm, is worth $300,000 if it's unrestricted, if he can develop it into houses. It's near Cedar Falls, people are growing that direction, that's a possibility. Joe Donor gives a conservation easement to INHF, giving up the right to develop it, subdivide it, or make changes to the property that would reduce the conservation value of the property. So he has to get a qualified appraisal, and this is not going to be cheap, and you're going to have to get somebody who does these. And somebody like Hertz Farm Management, there are not a lot of companies that know how to do this, because they have to appraise it without restrictions, and then they have to appraise it as restricted, and they have to determine what's the difference in those two values, and they have to know how to do that in a report that will satisfy the IRS. They also have to look at if you own other land in the area, and possibly that other land in the area's value goes up because now there's this protected land in the middle of it. They have to take that into consideration as well. And so it's not unusual for these to be $5,000 or more, in my experience. So you're going to have to pay some money for this appraisal. But we get one, and it says if we give up all these rights, and now it's just open space for wildlife habitat, public recreation, or private recreation, because it's just an easement, that it's only worth $100,000 instead of $300,000. So Joe Donor is making a $200,000 gift because he's reducing the value of his farm from $300,000 to $100,000 by giving Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation the right to keep him from developing, dividing that property interest up so they can enforce those restrictions. So he has a $200,000 charitable gift that he can deduct at the federal level and that he can take a credit with respect to half of at the state level. I am going to assume that his adjusted gross income is $1 million, which puts him in 37% rate, and then he files a timely income tax return, fully documents the gift, attaches a qualified appraisal, meets all the requirements, which is important. You need a tax accountant or tax preparer who is familiar with those requirements. I have represented donors who gave land to Luther College, and their deduction was denied because the appraisal wasn't in the right form. It was an appraisal issued to Luther College. And we were able on audit to get that resolved, but it was very scary for a little while. So you have to take those considerations seriously. So he's gonna, first of all, get an Iowa Conservation Gift credit of $100,000, which is half of the $200,000, and that is his cap. If it had been a bigger gift, he'd be capped at $100,000, and all he would get would be a deduction for the excess. Now, this is the part that's a little bit counterintuitive, and this is new in the last 10 years. but you can no longer you can't deduct your federal taxes on your state return, and you can't deduct your state taxes on your federal return. And when they changed that, the federal government and the IRS issued regulations that said, hold on, this credit, if you can get a credit for half your gift and you can deduct the whole gift, it's going to be too powerful. Basically, we think you're double dipping because we really think this 50% credit is a quid pro quo that's given by the state of Iowa to incent you to do this. So we're going to treat that as a quid pro quo for federal purposes, and we're only going to let you deduct on your federal return the rest of your gift. So you take the $100,000 credit, you can only deduct the other $100,000 of your gift, the other 50%. So at a 37% rate, you get a 37% federal tax benefit, which you can absorb again over 16 years if you need it. So your total tax benefit, state and federal, is $137,000, which is 68.5% of the value of your gift. You still own your farm, you're still doing all the things on your farm you wanted to do before. You've given up rights you really didn't want anybody else to ever do in the future anyway, and you protected the legacy of that property in perpetuity. So I think that's a pretty good story. If you're in an S Corp or an LLC, we gotta have a conversation, but I still think this is a really powerful thing. So that's kind of my talk about conservation gifts. I want to spend a little time talking about other concepts that are not kind of formally charitable gifts of land, but that I think are adjacent. So I've been talking to a lot of people about charitable remainder trusts lately. So a charitable remainder trust is a way to divide property either now or when you die into the tree and the fruit, right? And the fruit goes to someone you choose, often yourself and your spouse, if it's a retained interest charitable remainder trust, or if you do it when you die, maybe your children get the fruit for life. And when those lifetime beneficiaries pass, the tree goes to a charity, potentially Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation for conservation, potentially Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation as a farm that produces income to be used for conservation. And I've talked to a number of people about this concept. And so you can do this. You can put a farm in a charitable remainder trust. You can do it while you're alive, you can do it at death. And as long as we have measuring lives that are short enough that the charitable remainder interest is at least 10% actuarially, this works. If you want to do it for your grandchildren who are 2 and 3, it probably doesn't work because the math doesn't work. But you can create, a charitable remainder trust has to pay out at least 5% a year, but there's a special kind of charitable remainder trust that says you have to pay out at least 5% a year, but if the income is less, all you have to pay out is the income. And then if the income's over more, there's a makeup provision. So that's called a net income with makeup provisions charitable remainder unit trust. And so if you have a farm, it won't earn 5% a year. But you could say, well, we don't care what 5% a year, as long as the income's less, we'll just pay the income out to my children for life. And when my children are gone, the remainder goes to a conservation charity. Now, the people I've talked to, some of them have grandchildren, some of them don't. This is particularly popular for people who do not have grandchildren and would rather choose their charity rather than let their children do it. So that's one way to do charitable remainder trust. You can also just say, well, I don't want to give this away now because I want to keep the income for my life and my spouse's life. You can do that with a gift, with retained life estate. You could also do it through a charitable remainder trust. Well, second idea, sometimes people want to sell a farm or a business, and they know they're going to pay a huge amount of capital gains taxes. And it works better with the farm, honestly. But if you could put that into a charitable remainder trust, and the charitable remainder trust sells it, the charitable remainder trust does not actually pay capital gains taxes at the time of sale. So you avoid that big capital gains tax event. And then you get something like 5% a year back from that charitable remainder trust. You get the fruit. Now, that 5% distribution to you is going to carry those capital gains taxes out. You're not going to avoid them completely. But if you die before all of them have washed out to you, the portion you never received avoids tax. And usually the way the math works is some of it does avoid tax because when you die, the remainder goes to your charity. So it's a way to try to spread that gain out over time. And you also get a charitable, when you create a charitable remainder trust during life, The actuarial value of that remainder interest that passes to charity is a charitable gift, and you can take an income tax deduction for that. So you also get an income tax deduction, which is helpful in offsetting the other income you may have related to that scenario. So that's the second time to look at it. The third time, this is kind of new. So about 2020, there was a new tax law passed that limited our ability to give IRAs and 401ks to our kids and let them stretch that tax deferred income out over their life expectancy. The rule today is, unless your child is disabled or a minor, if you leave them an IRA by making them the beneficiary or a 401k, and it's not a Roth, they're going to have to take that out over 10 years after you die, and they're going to have to pay income on it all over that 10-year period. People have said, well, how can we get that lifetime stretch so that we can spread that income over a greater period of time? And the way to do that is with the charitable remainder trust. If you name a charitable remainder trust as the beneficiary of your IRA or 401k, the charitable remainder trust says, pay 5% out to my son every year for the rest of his life. When my son dies, it goes to the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. It is not bound by that 10-year requirement. And also, when it comes out of the charitable remainder trust, I guess more accurately, there's no tax because charitable remainder trust doesn't pay tax on that income. Now, every time you get 5%, your son gets 5% out of that charitable remainder trust, it will carry it out as ordinary income, just as it would have been if he'd taken it all at once. But if he lives 30 years, he can take it out over 30 years rather than 10. And if you're in an estate tax situation, the charitable remainder portion of that trust will escape estate tax. Few people face estate tax today. The exemptions as of 2026 will be $15 million. So a married couple, $30 million. Indexed to inflation going up every year. And for the first time in like 15 years, there's no sunset. So we're not worried that it's going to go down unless you have a new president, new Congress, and they all vote to change the law, which they can obviously do. But that's a nice way to try to stretch out income taxes on retirement accounts. And then just a couple more slides. Since I'm talking about charitable planning, 6 more ideas that I always mention. First, it's always better to give things away tax-wise while you're alive. It's also better if you want to kind of test a charity and develop a relationship to start giving them money or property and see how they are as a steward. And you know, the parable of the talents, if they do a good job, you can give them more later. If they do a bad job, maybe you give it to another charity. But you also get an income tax donation deduction on your income taxes if you itemize, if you do it during life. If you leave it to them at death, there is no income tax deduction. So that's always better to give during life. And if you are doing that, you say, well, Paul, you've convinced me I'm going to give $100,000 today to the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. If you have some appreciated stock, that's better than cash. If you have appreciated land, that's better than cash, because if you sell the stock or the land, you will pay capital gains tax. If you give $100,000 of land with the basis of $10,000 to INHF, you never pay tax on that gain, and you still get to deduct it at its fair market value of $100,000. Same with stock. So that's the second. Third, and a lot of my clients are talking about this year in particular. If you give $5, $10, $15, $20,000 to charity every year, the problem is the standard deduction for a married couple is $32,000, and for a single individual is $16,000. And if you don't have a mortgage, and you can only deduct $10,000 of state and local tax in certain circumstances, a lot of people don't itemize because they'd rather take that $32,000 standard deduction, which they lose if they itemize. But if let's just say you're giving $15,000 to charity every year, if instead you said, well, 5 times 15,000 is 75,000, why don't I give $75,000 to charity this year and then not make any charitable gifts in the next 4 years? I can itemize this year, I can take the standard deduction in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the way to do that is to create a donor advised fund, often in a community foundation, but you can do it at Hills Bank or Fidelity or wherever, and you park your money in there, and then you make grants from that fund over the next 4 years or until it's depleted. And that allows you to take your standard deduction 4 out of 5 years or 7 out of 8, whatever you do, but still get credit for your charitable gifts. It's a really good idea to do it this year, because starting next year, part of the big, beautiful Bill Act that was kind of snuck in there, and I don't know where it came from, is starting next year, the first 0.5% of your adjusted gross income you will not be able to deduct with charitable gifts. This year, there is no such law, so you get a little more bang for your buck doing it this year. There are a lot of other small things in that act about charitable giving, but beyond the scope of my talk today. A lot of my clients who are over 70 and a half and have big retirement accounts do not need the income and don't really want to pay the tax, and maybe they're not itemizing. So if you don't necessarily want to itemize and you don't need the money, up to $108,000 this year, you can just call your IRA provider and say, pay it directly to my favorite charity. And it never hits your bank account, it never hits your tax return, and it satisfies your required minimum distribution. Now, if your required minimum distribution is $120,000, you can only do 108 to charity, you'll have to take the other 12. But if it's 108 or less, you don't have to take anything out at all. This is just like a gift of grain. Farmers who take grain to market, they put it in the truck, and they say, this truck of grain belongs to Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. You don't get a deduction for it, but it never shows up on your income tax return. And so that's a good way to avoid having to itemize to get a charitable deduction if you're a farmer. Last couple, at death, if you want, I have a lot of clients come in and say, well, I'd like to give $20,000 or 5% of my estate to Boys and Girls Club, whatever it is. And I say, do you have an IRA or a 401k? And if they do, I say, well, do that by beneficiary designation on your taxable, not your Roth, retirement. Because if you leave that to your kids, they're going to pay income tax on it. If you leave it to charity, charity won't. And then what we do in their revocable trust or will is we put a provision in that says, it's my intention that $50,000 goes to the Boys and Girls Club. I believe I've made arrangements so that that will come by beneficiary designation from assets outside my estate, outside my trust. But if for some reason Boys and Girls Club ends up with less than $50,000 from those beneficiary designation assets, make up the difference from my trust. And then lastly, for those people who are quite wealthy, and I am fortunate, I get to work with a lot of these people, I've been talking to them recently about, so let's say they have 2 kids and they have $30 million, they can leave them tax-free, but maybe their total estate is $50 million. I'd say, you know, if both of your kids get $15 million from you, we can work really hard to try to get them more tax-free, but is that enough? You know, would they like to have a charitable legacy with the rest? Talk to them about it. You can give it directly to a charity, or we can even create a private family foundation that your kids can make grants from. So it's kind of like family money, but it's a charitable pot. And I'm surprised, I would say at least half of the families I'm having that conversation with are saying yes. At some point, unless it's a family business that represents all this wealth we don't want to sell, you know, I don't need to make my kids super wealthy. They're going to be able to live as well as I want them to live on $15 million each, and I would like to do something else interesting with the rest of my estate. A lot of times people approach me, I don't know, from an organization that thinks conservation is a liberal concept. And I always tell them, first of all, INHF was founded by Robert Ray, Republican governor, and this federal legislation was championed by Charles Grassley. So it is not a partisan notion. And I have a number of slides just because I'm interested in this. Teddy Roosevelt's one of my favorite presidents, kind of created the national parks, also a Republican. He said, here is your country, cherish these natural wonders, cherish the natural resources, cherish the history and romance as a sacred heritage for your children and your children's children. Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. And I mean, conservation and conservative have the same root. So to me, that's a very conservative notion. Don't destroy those parts of our legacy we were given to make a quick point. Anybody know who the cartoonist is here? Dane Darling, an Iowan. And if you go to Sanibel, if Sanibel still exists, there's the Dane Darling Preserve, and his gun is on the wall there. But he was a political cartoonist and really in favor of game, helped limit hunting. They were using these blunderbusses that could kill, 50 ducks in one shot, and he helped perform that. But he also preached that game management was good for land. So I like him. His legacy is at the University of Iowa Library and Special Collections. And another Iowan, I treat him as an Iowan, Wisconsin might argue, but Aldo Leopold is an Iowan, and he wrote, "To those devoid of imagination, a blank place on the map is a useless waste. To others, the most valuable part." He grew up was born in Burlington, Iowa, grew up in Iowa, went to the Yale Forestry, which is 2 blocks from my law school, and one of my favorites as well. And then, not an Iowan, but my dad always, in his talks, used Wizard of Oz cartoons, and we had this in a lot, but the king is looking at this canyon, and the landowner says, "Isn't this a beautiful canyon?" And the king says, "Yes, our search for a landfill is over. What will your land be later?"